With cold steel aimed at her loyal German shepherd, the brute delivered a cruel ultimatum. Decide who would draw their last breath. In a final desperate act, the young widow shielded her companion with her own body, bracing for the impact, closing her eyes to await the inevitable. But unseen by her, a Navy SEAL emerged from the deepening shadows, and his purpose was not to talk. It was to act. Before our story unfolds, let us know where you're joining us from. And if it moves, you please subscribe for more tales of courage. The late afternoon sun descended over historic Charleston, casting long, somber shadows that stretched across the city's cobblestone streets like a final curtain. Like the very hands of time, the air was a thick mixture of salt water from the harbor, mingling with the sweet, almost cloying perfume. The cloying perfume, the écume of jasmine, clung to the humid southern breeze, creating a kind of languid weather that seemed to move in slow motion. It compelled everyone to match its deliberate pace, yet for Matthew Carter, slowing down felt like an impossibility. He was a man built for forward momentum and precision. He stood just over 6 feet tall, his frame a testament to dense functional muscle sculpted by years of shouldering heavy packs through unforgiving lands. His dark hair was cut for pure function, while his piercing, slate-gray eyes never ceased their restless scan of everything around him. He was a Navy SEAL on mandatory administrative leave, a polite fiction the command used when what they really meant was, "Stop before you break." But the silence of the civilian world was a deafening roar far louder than any battlefield he'd ever crossed. Finding him now walking along the battery, it was the famed Seawall Promenade, where visitors typically gathered to photograph the majestic antebellum homes. But the crowds were thinning with the approaching dinner hour, and the Cooper River lapped at the stone wall with a rhythm that should have calmed him. Instead, it only amplified his sense of being adrift. Dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, he tried to fade in, but his posture betrayed him. He moved with a coiled, predatory grace, his head constantly swiveling, assessing rooftops, parked cars, and the hands of every passerby. It was a difficult instinct to unlearn this need to identify a threat before it could materialize. To quiet his mind, he turned into White Point Garden. The park was a sanctuary shaded by immense ancient oaks, their gnarled limbs forming a canopy draped in gray Spanish moss that danced in the breeze. It swayed like the beards of ancient ghosts, and beneath these silent sentinels, Matthew finally saw them. It was impossible not to notice the pair. Near the green's center, a woman tossed a tennis ball with a distracted, almost mechanical motion. She was undeniably striking. It wasn't a beauty that shouted for attention, but a quiet, melancholic grace that irresistibly drew the eye and held it. Her dark, wavy hair was loosely pulled back, revealing a pale neck and a face where exhaustion was etched into every feature. This was Alice Vance. A simple floral dress moved with the breeze, but her shoulders were set with a deep rigidity, suggesting she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. There was a fragility about her like fine china carefully mended after a fall, yet she stood tall, and beside her stood a truly magnificent creature, a German shepherd named Atlas. The dog was large, with a deep, black and tan coat, his ears pricked forward in a state of constant, unwavering watchfulness. He didn't run with a puppy's wild abandon, but moved with the focused discipline of a trained soldier each time he went to retrieve the ball. He would trot back to Alice, sitting precisely at her left, pressing his solid frame against her leg, as if to anchor her to the world. Matthew took a seat on a wrought iron bench yards away, partially hidden by the shadow of a massive oak. He wasn't concealing himself, but he wasn't prepared to be noticed. He watched Alice and knew she wasn't just playing with her dog. She was using the simple game as a distraction from something far heavier. Every few throws, her arm would fall, and her gaze would drift toward a line of imposing Victorian houses lining the street beside the park. Her expression would shift from a vacant numbness to a sudden, sharp-edged anxiety. It was a look Matthew recognized instantly. It was the gaze of a soldier, assessing a line she knew she couldn't defend. He questioned what ghosts she saw hiding in those homes. Was it a haunting memory, an unpaid debt, a looming threat? He didn't know her, but he recognized the crushing weight she carried. It was the same burden pressing on his own chest, the invisible pack of grief and unending watchfulness. The wind rose, rustling the leaves overhead, and sent a spray of acorns to the ground. Atlas's head snapped toward the noise, his body instantly tense, a low rumble vibrating from his chest. Before Atlas knew it was only the wind, Alice's hand was already there, sinking deep into the thick fur of her protector's neck. Her fingers curled, gripping tight. It was obvious the dog was more than a pet, he was her anchor. The one solid thing standing between her, and the deep abyss of sorrow threatening to pull her under. Matthew felt an unexpected jolt of kinship. He had his unit, or at least he used to. But out here in this jarring world of vivid colors and boisterous tourists, he felt like an alien. Seeing this woman and her dog, this steadfast unit of two against the world, made the isolation ache just a little less. The sun started its slow descent beneath the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of violet and fire. The park was emptying, falling into silence. Matthew knew it was time to retreat, back to the small rental that felt vast and empty. As he rose to his feet, the movement snagged the German shepherd's gaze just as Alice sent the ball flying. Her throw was weary, her aim untrue. The yellow sphere bounced wildly across the lawn, skittering past the gnarled roots of a tree, and rolled to a stop just a few feet from Matthew's boots. Atlas charged after it, a blur of focused speed, but stopped short of snatching it up. Instead, he froze. His gaze fell to the ball, then lifted slowly, deliberately to meet the eyes of the man towering over it. Matthew didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. He held his ground hands loose at his sides, a silent broadcast of calm, of no threat. He gazed down at the dog. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice rough and quiet from disuse. Atlas tilted his massive head, his amber eyes studying Matthew with an unnervingly human intelligence. The dog sensed no danger, only a quiet strength that mirrored his own. Atlas picked up the ball, then stood there waiting. Atlas, come here." Alice's voice sliced through the fading light, a melody laced with threads of panic as she hurried toward them, her dress tangling at her knees. Her face was a pale mask of worry. She couldn't stand her guardian being this close to a stranger, especially one who looked like him, who looked as if he could snap a bat in two. Matthew crouched, his movements slow and deliberate, careful not to startle the powerful dog. He offered his hand, palm open and upward. Atlas stepped forward and gently deposited the saliva-slick ball into Matthew's waiting hand. It was an offering of peace, a profound gesture of trust from an animal who gave it sparingly. Matthew rose to his feet just as Alice arrived. She stopped abruptly, breathless, her eyes wide with alarm. This close, Matthew could see the delicate lines of stress etched around her mouth and the deep shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of makeup could ever conceal. I'm so sorry," Alice stammered, as she reached for the dog's thick collar. "He doesn't usually bother people. He's just protective." "He's not bothering me," Matthew said, his voice calm. He glanced at the ball in his palm, then held it out for her to take. "He's a good soldier." Alice paused, her hand hovering over the dog's neck. She looked from the ball, then slowly up to Matthew's face. For a single heartbeat, the world around them dissolved. The traffic noise faded. The wind ceased. There was only the sheer intensity of their gazes locking. In her eyes, Matthew saw his own reflection, the broken pieces of a survivor's grief. In his, Alice saw a fortress of strength, battered, but never breached. It wasn't the spark of romance, not yet. It was something deeper, a silent recognition, a quiet understanding that they were both navigating a world that had lost its color. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand closing around the ball. Her fingers brushed against the calloused warmth of his, an electric current passing through the space between them. "I'm Matthew," he said. The name slipped from his lips before he could catch it. "Alice," she replied, her gaze falling to the devoted dog at his side, who was now leaning trustingly against Matthew's leg. "And this is Atlas." "A fitting name for him," Matthew nodded. He took a step back, breaking the sudden intensity of the moment, giving her room to breathe. "You too. Be safe getting home. It's getting dark." "You too," Alice replied, her eyes following him as he turned and walked away. His silhouette dissolved into the deepening shadows of the old oak trees. She knew nothing about him yet. As she clipped the leash onto Atlas's collar, she felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in months, the crushing weight of her solitude felt just a fraction lighter. She glanced back one last time. But the soldier was gone, leaving only the swaying Spanish moss and the first evening stars to bear witness. The next morning brought a false sense of peace to the streets of Charleston. The humidity hanging thick and sweet, a smothering blanket of wet wool. Matthew Carter was at a small wrought-iron table outside a corner cafe, nursing a black coffee now long since gone cold. He wasn't there for the caffeine. He was there because the same instincts that kept him alive in the Hindu Kush were now screaming a warning. That the woman and her dog from the park were in grave danger. He couldn't explain it, didn't need to justify it. He just watched. Across the street, near a local bakery, Alice Vance sat with a fortress of paperwork before her. In the harsh morning light, she looked smaller. The sunlight exposed a fragility she tried to conceal behind oversized sunglasses, while Atlas lay faithfully beneath her table. His massive paws were crossed, but his ears swiveled like radar dishes tuning into frequencies beyond human hearing. Matthew watched as Alice picked up her phone. Her gestures were animated, desperate, as she spoke to someone. Likely a lawyer, he guessed, or some city official. She was clinging to the naive belief that rules and regulations were a shield that could protect her. Matthew took a slow sip of cold coffee, his eyes narrowing. He knew better. In his world, rules were just lines in the sand washed away by the tides of greed and violence. And it didn't take long for that tide to roll in. Two men stepped out of a black sedan parked illegally in a loading zone down the block. They weren't tourists admiring the historic architecture. They moved with the predatory arrogance of men who believe they own the very pavement beneath their boots. The one in the lead was a man named Silas. He had sharp features, slicked back hair, and a suit that cost more than most cars, yet somehow still managed to look cheap on him. His eyes were cold, calculating, constantly shifting like a viper, searching for a place to strike. Flanking him was Jet, a stark contrast in every way. Jet was a mountain of a man, thick-necked and heavy-browed, with hands that looked like they could crush stone. His gaze was vacant, suggesting the lights were on. But nobody was home. The hammer to Silas's scalpel. Matthew shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair. His body relaxed into that familiar state of total readiness. He watched them approach Alice, their long shadows falling over her table like a shroud before they even spoke a word. But Atlas sensed them first. The German shepherd who had been resting peacefully went rigid in an instant. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself as the hair along his spine bristled into a rigid ridge. Startled, Alice dropped her pen. She looked up into the face of Silas looming over her, a predatory smile fixed on his lips that never reached his eyes. From this distance, the words were lost to Matthew, but the body language was crystal clear. Silas rested a hand on the back of the empty chair opposite Alice. He leaned in an invasive familiarity in his posture and tapped a single finger on the papers Alice was studying, deeds Matthew guessed, or perhaps insultingly low offers. Alice's spine straightened as she shook her head, her refusal firm. She then pointed toward the street, her message unmistakable, "Get out." Silas didn't yield. He let out a short, dismissive laugh, glancing down at Atlas, and the dog lunged, straining at the very end of his leash. Jaws snapped inches from Silas's expensive trousers. He flinched back, his polished composure cracking for a split second, revealing a flash of pure malice. Jet moved to step in his hand, twitching near his belt, but Silas raised a hand, stopping him, holding Alice in a final, lingering glare. Then the two men turned and disappeared around the corner of a brick building. Alice was left trembling, sinking down to wrap her arms around Atlas. She buried her face in his thick fur, desperate to draw strength from his unwavering presence before reaching for her phone once more. Her fingers dialed frantically. Matthew sighed. She was reporting the harassment he knew, filing a police report that would do no good, one that would just sit in a drawer until it was far too late. He knew he couldn't approach her directly, not yet. He'd just be another stranger in the shadows, so instead he dropped a few bills on the table and rose. If he truly wanted to protect her, he had to know the enemy he was facing. He moved like a shadow, tracking the path Silas and Jet had taken, finding them 2 blocks over in a secluded alley behind an old, forgotten theater. Far from the prying eyes of the public, Matthew melted into the recessed doorway of a shuttered, antique shop. Using the darkness as his cloak, he was now close enough to hear their voices cutting clearly through the damp alley air. "She's stubborn, I'll give her that," Silas seethed, lighting a cigarette with an angry flick of his lighter. He paced, the sharp click of his dress shoes echoing on the pavement. "The boss is getting impatient. The development deal for that estate has to close by the end of the month or the investors walk. We offered her double market value and she looks at me like I'm offering her dirt." Silas spat on the ground, his frustration boiling over. He was a man accustomed to getting his way through money or menace, and Alice's refusal was a direct insult to his ego. "So we just take it?" Jet asked, his voice a low rumble as he cracked his knuckles. "I can go back there, arrange an accident, make her too scared to stay in that big old house alone." "No," Silas hissed. Smoke coiled from his nostrils. "Too messy. The cops are already sniffing around the property's zoning. We can't touch her directly. Not yet. If she gets hurt, the estate goes into probate, and we're tied up in court for years." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he took a long drag of the cigarette. A cruel smile, like a dark epiphany, spread across his face. "She isn't afraid for herself. Did you see the way she clung to that mutt? That beast is the only thing holding her together. It is her crutch." A cold dread washed over Matthew, chilling him to the bone. It had nothing to do with the evening air. He watched Silas's face, seeing the motive shift from cold corporate greed to a twisted personal vendetta. Silas dropped his cigarette, grinding it into the asphalt under his heel with a vicious force. "We don't need to hurt her." Silas's voice dropped to a whisper far more terrifying than any shout. "We just need to shatter her spirit. If you take away the protector, the castle falls. Tonight we start pushing harder. But if she hasn't signed by the weekend..." Silas looked at Jet, his expression utterly devoid of humanity. "Target the dog. You make that animal a painful memory and she'll sign anything to escape it." A slow, ugly grin spread across Jet's face as he responded, "Consider it done." Matthew had heard more than enough. He vanished from the alley before they saw him, his heart pounding with a cold, precise fury. A fury that confirmed his deepest fears. These men weren't developers. They were predators who had located their prey's most vulnerable point. Alice thought this was a legal dispute over land, but she was truly in a war for her very soul. As he walked back toward the main street, the world blurred. His mind raced, formulating a plan. He knew the law ignored threats overheard in some dark alleyway. By the time the police ever answered a call about her dog, Alice would already be broken. He stopped dead at a crosswalk. His eyes looked toward Alice's estate. The line was crossed. They'd threatened someone innocent, both the woman and the loyal animal who protected her. And in Matthew's world, that kind of threat demanded a response found nowhere in a case file. He was no longer a civilian on leave. He was an operator with a new mission. The hunt was officially on. The drive back to the Vance estate felt like a journey back through time, on a narrow, unpaved road. It wound its way deep into the Charleston marshlands, guarded on both sides by massive ancient oaks that had stood watch for centuries. Their branches heavy with Spanish moss interlocked overhead, choking out the fading sun and plunging the path into a premature, ominous twilight. Alice Vance gripped her station wagon's steering wheel, her knuckles ghost white. The meeting with the city zoning official had been a complete dead end. One more bureaucratic wall meant to grind her spirit down. The radio was silent, leaving only the gravel crunching, and the steady, rhythmic panting of Atlas from the back. The German shepherd sensed her despair pacing in the small space. He would occasionally rest his heavy head on her shoulder from behind, offering a silent strength that was the only thing keeping her from pulling over to weep. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, her heart pounding at every shadow, but the road behind remained empty. She told herself the cafe incident was just intimidation, that men like Silas were bullies who folded when confronted. She was devastatingly wrong. As she came around the final blind curve a mile from her home, Alice slammed on the brakes. A large dark pickup was parked sideways across the road. No lights were on, no hazard flashers, just a menacing wall of steel in the gloom. Dust billowed around her car as she skidded to a stop. Her first instinct was to reverse, to flee back toward the distant safety of the city. But before she could shift gears, a violent blow shattered the driver's side window glass, exploding inward. Alice screamed, shielding her face from the glass shards as a massive hand reached in and flipped the lock. It was Jet. The brute had been hiding in the underbrush, melting into the dark like a predator. He ripped the door open with terrifying strength. Alice tried to scramble to the passenger side, but Jet seized her arm, hauling her out onto the gravel road like she was a rag doll. The breath was knocked out of her sharp stones, biting her palms. "Get off of her." Silas's voice cut through the chaos. He was smooth and chillingly calm as he stepped from the truck's shadow, a leather folder in hand, his suit immaculate despite the humidity. A stark contrast to his partner's brutality. Jet stepped back, but continued to loom over Alice, a heavy steel baton now in his hand. From the open car door, a black missile of fur and fury launched itself into the fray. Atlas had broken free with a roar that was more lion than dog. He closed the distance to Jet in a single leap, jaws snapping for the man's throat. But Jet was prepared. With practiced cruelty, he swung the steel baton. The metal connected with Atlas's ribs with a sickening thud, and the dog yelped a high-pitched cry of pain that tore Alice's heart in two and was slammed sideways into the dirt. But Atlas refused to stay down, whimpering as he favored his injured side. The German shepherd clawed his way back to his feet. Teeth bared, positioning himself between Alice and the men. He was hurt, his breathing labored and ragged, but his loyalty would not let him yield. "Call him off, Alice," Silas warned, stepping closer with a predatory calm. He drew a handgun from inside his jacket, a sleek silver pistol that caught the final rays of light, bleeding through the trees. He didn't point it at her. Instead, he aimed it directly at Atlas's head. "I don't like dogs," he said flatly. "They're messy loud." Alice fell to her knees, reaching out to clutch Atlas's collar, pulling the defiant, growling dog back into her embrace. She could feel his heart hammering against her own, his fur bristling with a primal fury. "What do you want?" She sobbed, the words torn from her throat. "I told you," she managed, her voice trembling. "I'm not selling." Silas sighed, the sound of a weary teacher dealing with a difficult student. He opened the leather folder and slid a document out, letting it drift onto the dirt in front of her, followed by a pen. "The offer has changed," he said coolly. "The price is substantially lower now. A convenience fee, we'll call it. Forcing us to come all the way out here?" He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers, even as the gun remained trained on Atlas. "You have a choice to make, Alice," he purred. "A simple binary choice. You sign that paper, transfer the deed, and you walk away. Or," he cocked the hammer, the mechanical click echoing ominously in the swamp's silence. You choose who dies first.
You! Or the beast!
The cruelty of the choice was suffocating. Silas was savoring it, watching her eyes dart from the paper to the gun. Boban, savoring her terror. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a sadist who fed on control. Personally, Silas mused, tapping the gun's barrel against his chin. I'd shoot the dog first, watch the light go out of his eyes, because I know he's the only family you have left. And then once you're well and truly alone, well, accidents happen in these marshes. Alice's eyes fell to the paper on the ground. It was just land, just a house. Nothing but wood and brick and dirt. Then she looked at Atlas, and he looked up at her. His amber eyes were filled with pain, yet also an unbreakable devotion. Gently, he licked the tears from her cheek. He completely ignored the man with the gun ready to give his life for her. In that split second, the fear that had paralyzed Alice evaporated. It was replaced by a fierce, primal protectiveness. She realized that without Atlas, the house was just an empty tomb. He was her home. No, Alice whispered. Excuse me? Silas frowned, taken aback. His smile faltered. I said no! Alice screamed, and instead of reaching for the pen, she threw herself over Atlas. She covered his body with hers, burying her face in his neck and curling into a ball, shielding the dog completely. Her back was now exposed to the gunman. You want to shoot him? She cried out. You have to go through me, so shoot me, go ahead. But you are not touching him. The air grew heavy, thick with tension. Silas stood up, his expression a mask of cold fury. His game had backfired. He had expected her to cower, to beg to sign away her legacy to save her skin. He hadn't accounted for love. He hadn't factored in the strength of a woman who had already lost everything once, and who refused to lose again. Jet shifted uneasily, looking to his boss, waiting for a command. Have it your way, you stupid woman. Silas spat, then raised the gun, aiming it at the back of Alice's head. The silence of the woods stretched thin, about to break. The air was shattered by Alice's sobbing prayers and the defiant growl of the dog below her as Silas tightened his hold on the cold steel. His finger curled on the trigger, prepared to offer a final deadly answer as the forest shadows seemed to draw closer, waiting, watching as greed prepared to extinguish devotion. The sharp click of the hammer on Silas's pistol cracked like thunder through the oppressive silence. Through that moss-draped tunnel of trees, time seemed to halt for a split second, hanging heavy and suffocating over Alice's terrified, trembling body. But before Silas's finger could apply that last ounce of pressure required to end a life, the shadows to his right erupted into motion. This was not a chaotic frenzy of movement. It was a targeted, deliberate, kinetic assault. Matthew Carter didn't just step from the darkness. He was born from it, moving with a velocity the naked eye could barely register. He was a streak of gray and denim, erasing the distance from the tree line to the gunman in one breathtakingly fluid motion. He offered no warning. He gave no opportunity for surrender. In his world, when a gun is pointed at an innocent, the time for talk has passed. With brutal precision, Matthew's hand chopped down on Silas's wrist, shoving the barrel toward the ground, just as pure reflex made Silas squeeze the trigger. The wild shot buried itself harmlessly in the gravel, its sharp report sending birds exploding from the canopy. And in that same heartbeat, Matthew was inside Silas's guard. Using his hip for leverage, he seized the man's forearm, wrenching it backward against the joint's natural bend with devastating force. A horrifying, dry snap echoed the unmistakable sound of bone giving way under extreme pressure. Silas let out a piercing shriek. A high, jagged scream of unadulterated agony tore from his throat as the pistol tumbled from his useless hand, and Matthew caught it mid-fall. It was a maneuver perfected 1,000 times over in desolate training grounds and mock firefights halfway around the globe. With a shove that carried the brutal force of a battering ram, Matthew sent the screaming man staggering back into the dirt as Jet, the giant enforcer, moved. He roared in shock, and charged his steel baton raised to obliterate this new threat, but for all his size and power, he fought like a common barroom brawler. But Matthew was a master of combat. As Jet swung wildly, Matthew didn't back away. He moved into the path of the blow. He jammed the barrel of the captured pistol brutally into Jet's sternum, the impact knocking the air from the big man's lungs, freezing him completely. Matthew held his fire. Instead, he met Jet's eyes with a look utterly devoid of any fear, any rage, only cold, hard purpose. It was a gaze of pure, professional calm. "Take him and leave," Matthew commanded, his low, steady voice slicing through Silas's pathetic sobs like a blade. "Or the next round goes into your knee." Jet's eyes darted from the gun against his chest to his boss, who was writhing there in the dirt. He saw him clutching a shattered arm, and finally his gaze met the man before him, seeing a truth in Matthew's eyes that scared him more than any siren ever could. He was looking at a man who had stared into the abyss and returned with its secrets. The bully in Jet vanished. He dropped the baton hands, flying up in surrender. Scrambling backward, he grabbed Silas by his pricey suit jacket, yanking the whimpering man up from the ground and onto his feet. They stumbled away toward their truck, throwing terrified looks behind them, now understanding that they had provoked something truly dangerous. It was a force they were hopelessly unprepared to face. Matthew kept the pistol aimed at them, his finger resting safely alongside the frame. Not on the trigger. He maintained flawless discipline until they had piled into the truck's cab and the engine roared violently to life. Tires churned gravel as the truck fishtailed wildly, then peeled out, disappearing into the growing darkness of the night. Only after the red glow of the taillights disappeared around the curve did Matthew finally lower the gun, methodically clicking on the safety, and secured it in the small of his back. The immediate danger had passed. His attention snapped back to the woman crumpled on the ground. Alice was motionless, still curled over Atlas, her body trembling uncontrollably as the wave of adrenaline finally crashed. The echo of the gunshot, the sickening crack of bone, the brutal explosion of violence, it was an assault on a soul already shattered by grief. "Alice," Matthew murmured, his voice shedding its soldier's edge for something softer, more human. "It's over. They're gone." Alice looked up, her eyes wide and vacant, the pupils dilated with a profound, unseeing shock. Her gaze passed right through Matthew, a stranger in her fractured world, as her breath hitched in short, ragged gasps like tearing silk. He was going to... She stammered, her knuckles bone white as she clutched Atlas's fur. "The gun! Atlas!" Her world dissolved into a dizzying spiral, the crushing stress of the past months, the unending grief for her husband. And then the pure terror of the moment, it all came crashing down, a tidal wave that finally pulled her under as her eyes rolled back and her grip went limp. She slumped into the dirt, unconscious. Alice Matthew was at her side in an instant, dropping to his knees in the dust. His fingers found her pulse, rapid but strong. She had fainted, her mind shutting down to escape the overwhelming trauma. He released a breath he hadn't known he was holding, his relief palpable, before turning to the loyal dog. Atlas was whining softly, nudging Alice's limp hand with his wet nose. The German Shepherd was clearly favoring his left side, where the baton had landed. Matthew ran his practiced hands gently but firmly over the dog's ribs. Atlas flinched in pain, but never snapped, as if he understood this man was an ally. Cracked ribs, Matthew suspected. Definitely bruised. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" Matthew muttered, his respect for the dog growing. He knew without question he could not leave them there. This road was dark, exposed. Those men could come back, and with friends, he had to move them. He rose to his feet and lifted Alice into his arms. She felt impossibly light, as fragile as a bird with hollow bones. Her head rested against his chest, a dead weight. Her dark hair cascaded over his arm as he adjusted his grip, holding her securely. He looked down at the dog. "Can you walk, soldier?" Atlas struggled, letting out a sharp huff of pain as he pushed himself up, but his stance was steady. The dog's gaze fixed on Alice, safe in Matthew's arms. His eyes then met Matthew's, and he gave a short, resolute bark. He was ready. Matthew turned and began the long walk back toward his own vehicle. It was hidden a few hundred yards down a dark logging trail. He moved with a steady, rhythmic gait, carrying the unconscious woman with a reverence reserved for something sacred. Atlas, a wounded warrior rescued from the battlefield, limped faithfully beside him, pressing against Matthew's leg every few steps for reassurance. And so the unlikely trio moved through the night, leaving the violence behind. But as he walked, Matthew's mind was already processing the tactical situation. He'd let them go. A risk. In a war zone, it might have been a fatal error. But this wasn't a war zone. Not with a civilian down and an animal wounded. Extraction was the priority. He couldn't give chase and leave Alice vulnerable. He had made a choice to save, not to pursue. Not to destroy. Reaching his truck, Matthew gently settled Alice into the passenger seat, his movements careful and deliberate. He reclined the seat so she could rest, then lifted Atlas into the back, wincing in sympathy as the wounded dog groaned in pain. After settling him on a blanket, Matthew slid into the driver's seat, but paused, pulling the captured silver pistol from his waistband. He weighed it in his palm. It was cold, heavy smelling of oil and malice, tangible proof of a line that had just been violently crossed. His eyes scanned the empty darkness where Silas and Jet had vanished as the deep, unnerving silence of the marsh reclaimed the night. The night was alive only with the sound of crickets. Yet for Matthew, the silence was a deafening roar. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a stark silhouette against the moon's pale light, his jaw clenched into a resolute line as the muscles in his neck coiled like steel. They had chosen fear as their weapon, believed themselves the hunters. They had no idea they'd just trespassed in the one forest they should have feared. Matthew holstered his weapon, his gaze as cold and unforgiving as winter stone. He had saved her tonight, but this was only the first battle. Not next time, he vowed to the empty road. It was a promise sworn to the shadows themselves. Next time you're not walking away. With that, he climbed back into the truck. The engine roared to life, pulling them from the heart of the nightmare and toward the only sanctuary he knew, the Vance estate. It materialized from the darkness like a forgotten memory, a sprawling Victorian farmhouse set against the moon-drenched marsh, its high peaks and wraparound porches a silhouette of a bygone era. Forged in a time when homes were built to defy the coastal furies, it felt like a fortress. Matthew guided the truck up the long gravel drive. The crunch of the tires on stone was a sound too sharp for the suffocating silence of the night. He cut the headlights well before they reached the house, letting the truck coast to a silent stop in the deep shadows of ancient oaks. The raw adrenaline from the roadside clash had now hardened into a cold, clear focus. He was done reacting. Now he was planning. He carried Alice inside the door, swinging shut behind the kick of his heel. The air inside, fragrant with lavender and old paper, was a scent of peace that warred against the stench of blood and fear clinging to them. He laid her down gently upon the sprawling floral sofa, checking her pulse one last time. It was stronger now, her breathing easing into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. For the moment, she was safe. But his gaze immediately shifted to the night's other wounded soldier. Atlas had limped in behind them, his claws making an unsteady rhythm on the hardwood floor. The great dog stood watch in the center of the room, a slight tremor running through his powerful frame, his breath catching in shallow hitches. That baton had done its work. Matthew moved swiftly toward the kitchen. His boots echoed with purpose on the floorboards as he returned with a bowl of fresh water and the first aid kit from his truck. It was a military-grade trauma pack, one that had seen far more desert sand than manicured lawns. He knelt before the wounded animal. "Come here, soldier," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, soothing rumble that spoke of shared battles. For a moment, Atlas hesitated, his amber eyes glancing toward Alice's sleeping form before returning to the man. Then slowly, painfully, the loyal dog lowered his body onto the rug. He exposed his injured side, an act not of submission, but of profound trust in the one he followed. Matthew's hand, scarred and calloused from years of war and wilderness, moved with a tenderness that defied their history. He gently cleaned the matted fur with a damp cloth, his fingers probing the bruised ribs with an expert's care. Atlas let out a high, keening whine, but instead of pulling back, he pressed his muzzle into Matthew's knee, searching for comfort. "You took a bad one," Matthew whispered, applying a soothing gel before carefully wrapping the dog's torso with a compression bandage. "But you held the line, didn't you, good boy?" The image of the hardened warrior tending to his wounded companion was a portrait of profound contrast violence and healing intertwined in the same steady hands. As he secured the final wrap, he felt a gaze upon him and looked up. Alice was sitting on the sofa, her eyes wide with a storm of confusion and dawning terrible memory. She watched him gently stroke Atlas's head, her hand flying to her mouth as the full horror of the ambush came rushing back. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice fractured with emotion. It wasn't a question but a breathless truth. Matthew sat back on his heels. "Just leveling the playing field," he said quietly, wiping his hands. "How are you?" "Like I've woken up in a nightmare," Alice admitted, pulling her knees tight to her chest. She glanced around the room, her sanctuary now feeling so terribly fragile. "They aren't stopping, are they?" she asked Matthew. "He said a lot of things," Matthew interjected, his voice firm but gentle. "Talk is cheap. Tell me why Alice? Why this house? Why are they willing to kill for it?" Alice took a shaky breath, her eyes drifting to a framed photo on the mantel, a black and white image of a young man in a proud naval uniform. He was standing right in front of this house. "It's not just a house," she explained, a new strength rising in her voice. "It has been in the Vance family for 4 generations. My husband, David, he died serving overseas 2 years ago. This place and Atlas, they are all I have left of him. Silas, he fronts a development consortium. They want to dredge the marsh, build condos, erase everything that makes this land live. They offered money, then threats. Now," she gestured helplessly at the window. "Now they're after blood." Matthew nodded gravely. It was the oldest story in the world, greed paving right over history. But hearing it from her, seeing the fierce, desperate protection in her eyes, shifted something in him. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. This was a defense of sacred ground. "We can't leave," Matthew said, getting up to pace the length of the old room. His eyes scanned the windows, the doors, the angles of attack. "If we run, they win. And if we go to the local cops, we don't know who is on Silas's payroll." He was far too confident about all the zoning. "So what do we do?" Alice asked, fear returning to her eyes. "We dig in," Matthew stated, his voice now resolute. His tone was final. "We turn this house into something they can't swallow." He moved with new purpose, locking deadbolts and drawing thick curtains. He moved furniture, creating barricades and solid cover points. He was transforming this warm home into a forward operating base. Alice watched him, and for the first time since David died, she didn't feel like a victim waiting for the blow. She felt like she had an army. Matthew returned to his military rucksack by the front door, unzipping a hidden pocket at the very bottom, revealing a piece of equipment that seemed so out of place among the antiques, a compact, rugged GPS beacon and satellite communicator. It was black, utilitarian, and hummed with a latent electronic power. This was his lifeline, a link to a world above the corruption of small-town politics. He knew the local sheriff was compromised. Silas's arrogance all but confirmed that. He needed someone who answered to a much higher code. He keyed in a sequence of commands, the device's small screen glowing green in the dim light. He wasn't calling 911. He was sending a coded distress signal to a specific coordinate, one tagged with a Priority 1 clearance. "Who are you calling?" Alice whispered, watching the device blink. "A friend," Matthew replied, eyes glued to the screen as the signal locked. Someone who hates bullies as much as I do. He was thinking of Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, a state trooper from a joint task force years ago. She was relentless, incorruptible, and she owed him a big favor. More importantly, she operated outside the reach of the local swamp rats Silas controlled. The device beeped once, a solid tone confirming the message was received. Matthew exhaled a small measure of tension finally leaving his shoulders. The cavalry was on its way, but it would take time. Until then, it was just him, Alice, and the wounded dog against the world, against whatever darkness was waiting in the woods. He looked at Alice, then at Atlas, who had limped over to rest his head on Matthew's boot once more. Try to get some rest. Matthew urged, his voice low, as he positioned a chair to face the front door, methodically checking the magazine of the silver pistol, the one he'd taken from Silas. I'll take the first watch. A storm was brewing outside, but within the fortress of the Vance estate, a line had been irrevocably drawn. The storm didn't just arrive. It descended with a violence that rattled the very foundations of the marsh. Thunder cracked across the low country like artillery, its vibrations shuddering through the floorboards as relentless rain lashed against the siding, coming down in sheets driven by a wind that howled through ancient oaks, twisting their branches into skeletal fingers, clawing at the roof. Inside, the lamp's warm glow flickered once, then twice before dying completely, plunging the house into a sudden, suffocating darkness. A blackness shattered only by strobing flashes of lightning that painted the room in haunting, ghostly monochromes. Alice gasped, the blanket she'd wrapped around herself falling away as the sudden darkness landed like a physical blow, shattering her illusion of safety. An illusion she had built over the last hour. She reached out blindly, her hand trembling. "Matthew, stay right where you are!" Matthew's voice cut through the darkness, unnervingly calm. "Don't move. Let your eyes adjust." A moment later, a small, shielded beam from a tactical light pierced the gloom. Matthew moved through the room, not with a civilian's hesitation, but with the fluid grace of a predator in its element. He reached the window, peering through a thin crack in the heavy curtains he'd drawn. Outside, through the storm's chaos, he saw them. 2 vehicles had pulled up at the end of the long drive, their lights extinguished. Dark figures detached themselves from the tree line. There were more this time. It was clear Silas hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to erase a mistake, and he'd brought reinforcements. Among them was the familiar, hulking shape of Jet. But there was a new figure. Through the rain-slicked glass, illuminated by a flash of lightning, Matthew saw a man who moved differently. This one was lean, wiry, dressed in dark, practical clothing instead of a cheap suit, and carrying a pry bar and a heavy tool bag. This had to be Kane, a professional breaker, a man hired not for loyalty, but for his skill in bypassing any lock and silencing alarms without a trace. His face was sharp and angular, his eyes cold and dead as they scanned the house with chilling detachment. Silas was getting desperate. He knew if that gun Matthew had taken, the one registered to him, reached the authorities, his career and freedom were finished. He was throwing everything he had at this house to get it back. "They cut the power," Matthew stated, turning back into the room. "Phone lines will be next if they're not gone already." He moved toward the kitchen, his boots silent, Alice following, clutching his shirt like a lifeline. She watched in bewilderment as he raided her pantry and utility drawers. But he wasn't searching for weapons. He was looking for geometry. He pulled out a spool of high-test fishing line, a bag of white flour, and a box of light bulbs. "What are you doing?" Alice whispered, her voice nearly lost in the drumming rain. "Creating a home field advantage," Matthew replied, moving to the hallway and foyer, the most likely points of entry. He began to string the fishing line, pulling it taut across the floorboards at ankle height, invisible in the dark, yet strong enough to send a man sprawling. Next, he took the bag of flour, dusting the floor by the back entrance and the hallway junction. "In the dark, I can't see them," he explained, gesturing to the powder. "But if they step in this, they'll leave a trail. I'll know exactly where they are and where they're headed. Finally, he took the light bulbs, wrapped them in a cloth, and crushed them quietly under his boot, sprinkling the shards beneath the mudroom windows. It was a primitive alarm, the sound of broken glass. Alice watched her awe warring with her terror as he dismantled her home piece by piece, and yet in the chaos she had never felt more secure. He wasn't just reacting, he was sculpting the battlefield, guiding her to a haven beneath the main stairs, a small fortified closet built for storage, its walls thick and defensible. His command was a lifeline. "Get inside." He pressed a heavy flashlight into her hand, keeping it off. "Atlas stays with you," he murmured. "He's hurt. If he barks, he gives my position away. Keep him calm. If anyone but me opens this door." He paused, his gaze burning into her with a raw intensity. "You scream. You scream with everything you have." Alice nodded, tears streaming down her face as she guided the limping dog into the cramped, dark space with her. Atlas whined softly, sensing the coming separation, but settled as Alice buried her face into his neck. Matthew pulled the door until it was just a fraction ajar. Leaving them cocooned in the safety of shadows, he moved back to the living room center, holstering the silver pistol he had claimed from Silas. He kept it sheathed. He wanted them to feel confident walking in to wander deep into the web before the spider stirred as the storm outside unleashed its fury. The wind hammered the house like a physical assault, masking their approach. But Matthew's senses were calibrated to a far sharper frequency. He closed his eyes, filtering out the thunder, listening only for the unnatural sounds, the quiet, cold click of metal on metal. The groan of a floorboard, the ragged breathing of men fueled by adrenaline and malice. And then it began. From the east wing by the library came the sharp, unmistakable report of shattering glass. It wasn't the wind. A window had been breached. The shards of light bulbs Matthew had laid as a carpet crunched under a heavy boot. They were in. Matthew killed his tactical light. The house plunged into an absolute abyssal blackness. He was no longer Matthew Carter, the man on leave. He was a ghost. He moved toward the library, his steps perfectly silent, his breathing regulated as he glided past the closet under the stairs. He paused for a heartbeat, whispering into the void, a promise meant for the terrified woman and her loyal dog trembling in the dark. "Trust me." And then he dissolved into the shadows. The hunt had begun. The intruders thought they were just breaking into a house. They saw only a helpless woman and a wounded animal. They couldn't know they had just stepped into a cage with something far more dangerous than the raging storm. The house was no longer a home. It was a labyrinth of shadows and silence, its pulse matching the rhythm of the storm. The darkness was total. A heavy velvet curtain that swallowed the intruders, stripping away their confidence layer by layer. Matthew moved through the blackness, not by sight, but by memory and instinct. He had memorized the creak of every floorboard in preparation, and now he used that intimate knowledge to become a phantom. He crouched behind the heavy oak armchair in the corner of the living room, simply listening. The sound of boots scuffing the hardwood was distinct. There were 3 of them moving through the foyer. Kane the professional took the lead. He was followed by the hulking mass of Jet and finally Silas, whose frantic breathing betrayed his desperation as they began to sweep the ground floor. Their tactical lights slashed narrow, jerky beams through the stale air. They were hunting, but they were oblivious to the fact that they were the ones being herded. Kane took point, his flashlight sweeping low, cautious and professional. He spotted the fishing line Matthew had strung across the hallway entrance just in time to step over it. "Watch your step," Kane hissed to the others. "He's rigged the place." But as Kane's boot cleared the line, it landed squarely in a patch of white flour. Matthew had dusted the threshold. A puff of white powder bloomed in the air, stamping a distinct white footprint onto the dark wood. In the pitch black, a grim smile touched Matthew's lips. He didn't need his eyes, only the spectral white trails they left behind. The moment Kane drifted past the armchair, Matthew moved. He needed no weapon rising from the deepest shadows like a vengeful specter. His arm snaked around Kane's throat, a silent, unforgiving vice. Cain thrashed for a heart-stopping second, his flashlight clattering and spinning wildly across the floorboards. The beam cast chaotic dancing shadows on the walls as Matthew applied relentless pressure, stealing the life from his foe. It took only moments before Cain's body went slack. Matthew eased him soundlessly to the ground and vanished once more into the inky blackness. Before Jet or Silas could even react, a whisper cut through the silence. "Cain." Silas's voice trembled with fear. Where did he go?" "He was right here," Jet snarled, slicing his heavy baton through nothing but empty air. "Come on out, soldier boy. Stop playing these damn games!" Then from the hallway's abyss, a low, menacing growl echoed. It was Atlas. The loyal dog hadn't stayed put. He had felt the danger to his family, and despite his pain, limped out to defend them. The growl was a disembodied threat, ricocheting off the walls. It was impossible to tell where the dog was. As Jet spun toward the sound, utterly distracted, Matthew saw his chance and lunged from the darkness. He slammed his shoulder hard into the big man's gut, the force sending them both careening into a side table, shattering a lamp. But Jet was powerful. Fueled by raw fury, he threw Matthew back and raised his baton for the final crushing blow, his form a terrifying silhouette against a sudden flash of lightning. But then a cloud of blinding white powder erupted in Jet's face. Alice, stepping from the dining room shadows, was done hiding. In her hands, she gripped a heavy red fire extinguisher. She'd pulled the pin, unleashing a suffocating torrent of chemical foam straight into Jet's eyes. The behemoth roared, blinded and gagging, dropping his weapon to claw desperately at his burning face. Matthew didn't waste a second, sweeping the man's legs from under him. He followed with a single, precise strike to the temple. The giant crumpled to the floor, out cold. "Alice, get back," Matthew commanded. But it was too late. The chaos had summoned the final predator. Silas stood near the fireplace. He was the last one standing, the fear in his eyes twisting into a desperate, dangerous resolve. His muscle was gone, his advantage lost. He had nothing left to lose. He didn't have a firearm. Instead, his hand went to his belt, pulling free a long, serrated hunting knife. Its wicked blade glinted in the strobing lightning of the storm. "I am not leaving without that deed," Silas shrieked, his voice fracturing with madness. "And I am not leaving you alive." He lunged the knife, slicing viciously through the air. Matthew dodged, but the weight of the fight was beginning to pull him down. He retreated, trying to create distance, but his foot slipped on the slick powder coating the floor. He stumbled, falling hard to one knee beside the hearth. Silas saw his chance. He raised the knife high, poised to drive it deep into Matthew's chest. "Die!" He screamed a sound of pure hate. But the blade never fell. A dark, furry missile launched itself from the floor. It was Atlas defying his bruised ribs and injured leg. He soared through the air not for the throat, but for the weapon. His powerful jaws locked onto Silas's forearm with incredible force. Teeth sank deep through expensive fabric and into the flesh beneath. Silas howled in agony, the knife falling from his grasp as the 90-pound dog dragged his arm down. Atlas shook his head violently. Silas hammered the dog with his free fist, screaming, Get off me!" Atlas cried out as a blow landed on his injured side, but his grip was iron. He was buying his master precious time as Matthew scrambled back to his feet. The fallen knife was too far away. He needed something, anything. "Matthew, catch." Alice's voice cut through the chaos, clear and defiant. She stood by the wood rack, and with every ounce of her strength, she sent a heavy piece of oak firewood spinning through the air. The toss was clumsy, a desperate spin through the air, but Matthew's instincts, forged in the crucible of combat, took over as he snagged the heavy log from its flight. Unleashing a guttural roar, Matthew swung the timber like a desperate man at the plate, and it met Silas's jaw with a brutal, resounding crack. A sickening thud echoed not the snap of bone, but the very sound of a man's will being extinguished. Instantly, Silas's eyes went vacant, rolling back into his skull. He collapsed in a heap, a marionette whose strings had been severed. Atlas instantly released his hold, retreating to Matthew's side, his chest heaving, his muzzle stained with the blood of another. A profound silence flooded the room, more crushing than the chaos it replaced, pierced only by the storm's weeping and the ragged gasps of the survivors. The floor was a battlefield strewn with the vanquished. Matthew let the log fall from his grasp, his lungs burning his gaze, finding Atlas and then locking with Alice's. She stood like a phantom in the ruins of her own home, dusted in white powder, the fire extinguisher still gripped tight in her defiant hand. But the tremors had ceased. Her eyes swept over the fallen intruders, then lifted to meet Matthew's, a new fire burning where fear had once lived. Illuminated by the strobing lightning, they were no longer victims. They were a pack, bloodied and battered, that had fiercely defended its den. "Is it over?" Alice breathed carefully, stepping over Jet's still form, as Matthew prodded Silas's limp body with the toe of his boot, a grim confirmation. Satisfied he was no threat, he reached down his hand, finding Atlas's loyal head, feeling the powerful dog lean into his touch. "For tonight," Matthew rasped. His voice was gravelly with exhaustion, yet unbreakable. "It's over. We held the line." Then his gaze settled on Alice, truly seeing her for the first time. The delicate widow from the park had vanished. In her place stood a warrior forged in the night's crucible who had stared into the abyss and refused to fall. The cacophony of violence had faded, leaving behind the steady, quiet pulse of their shared courage. And as if on cue, the storm finally broke with the first blush of dawn. A sliver of gray light bled across the eastern horizon as the deluge, which had beaten a frantic war drum on the roof all night, finally surrendered. The downpour softened to a whisper, then ceased, leaving a world baptized, and cleaned the air rich with the scent of damp earth ozone and pine. A profound silence descended, a comforting weight of peace settling upon the Vance estate, only to be pierced by the faint approaching cry of sirens. These weren't the familiar warble of the local sheriff's cars. This was the guttural, commanding howl of powerful engines devouring the pavement of the marsh road. Matthew Carter stood watch on the porch, arms folded across his chest, his gaze fixed on the approaching kaleidoscope of red and blue lights. They sliced through the morning fog like a surgeon's blade. He was sleepless, but the ache in his bones felt earned, not the heavy shroud of old ghosts. It was the clean, honest pain of a battle won. Nearby, Alice Vance sat on the porch swing, cocooned in a blanket, cradling a mug of hot coffee he'd made for her. The last of her trembling had vanished. Her eyes, now crystal clear, were locked on the approaching lights with a newfound, unyielding resolve. Atlas rested at her feet, his ribs freshly bandaged, and his noble head on his paws, but his eyes remained open, ever watchful. He watched the drive with the solemn vigilance of a soldier on watch, knowing his relief was finally arriving as the vehicles thundered up the gravel path. Their tires chewed the gravel as they spread out in a precise tactical display. This was the varsity team, the state troopers, the Highway Patrol's elite response team, mobilized hours earlier by the priority distress signal Matthew had broadcast out into the storm. Doors flew open in perfect sync as officers poured out, their weapons drawn, but held low, moving with the fluid, quiet discipline of true professionals. At their head was Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, a statuesque woman with iron gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her face a roadmap of hard-won experience, the kind that comes from looking into the darkness of the human heart and never flinching. Her uniform was her armor, her every step deliberate as she advanced toward the porch. Matthew descended the steps to meet her. No salute passed between them, only a simple nod that conveyed a profound, unspoken respect forged over years. From their joint task force days, Jenkins's gaze swept past him to the battered front door, the broken window, and the three subdued men, now zip-tied and groaning on the living room floor. "You sure know how to spend a vacation, Carter," Jenkins remarked. her voice as dry and rough as sandpaper. She motioned for her officers to enter the house and secure the prisoners. "I got your ping. We bypassed the local dispatch. Figured if you were calling, it wasn't for some simple noise complaint. These fellas needed a real wake-up call," Matthew replied calmly, gesturing toward the house. "Silas and his crew. Breaking and entering assault with a deadly weapon. Attempted murder. I secured the evidence. The gun is on the mantel bagged and ready for forensics," he finished as officers hauled the intruders out. Just then the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long golden beams across the dew-kissed grass. Silas was the first to be brought out. Dragged between two imposing troopers, his expensive suit was utterly ruined, caked in flour and mud. His face was swollen from the impact of the firewood. He saw Alice standing on the porch and opened his mouth, ready to unleash something. A threat, a plea, a lawyer's name. But the words died in his throat the moment he met her gaze. She didn't look away. She didn't even flinch. She stood tall, a queen gazing down at a peasant who had dared to try and steal her crown. Defeated Silas slumped. He was shoved into the back of a cruiser. Jet and Kane followed, battered and silent. The threat that had loomed over the estate like a gathering thunderhead was finally being dismantled piece by piece and driven away in the back of police cars. The processing on site took hours, but by the time the sun climbed high into the sky, the estate was quiet once more. Jenkins firmly shook Matthew's hand. She promised to keep the case under state jurisdiction, steering clear of any local corruption, and then led the convoy away. Matthew stood alone in the driveway, his duffel bag packed and slung over his shoulder. His leave was officially over. The Navy needed him back. His team was spinning up for a deployment. The world was full of other storms that needed navigating. He turned to face Alice, who had changed into fresh clothes, jeans and a simple shirt, but she wore them differently now. The stoop of the grieving widow was gone, replaced by the posture of a woman who had defended her home and won. "You're leaving," Alice said softly. It wasn't an accusation, just a quiet acknowledgement of the reality they both faced. "My time's up," Matthew said, shifting the weight of the bag on his shoulder. "I have to report back to Virginia by tonight." Alice walked down the porch steps, Atlas limping bravely right beside her. She stopped just a few feet away from him. There were 1,000 things she could have said thank you, stay, don't go, but none of them felt big enough to contain the moment. Instead, she simply reached out and took his hand, her grip firm. "You gave me back more than just this house, Matthew," she said, her voice unshakable. "You reminded me that I can still fight, that we're not alone." Matthew looked down at Atlas. The loyal dog nudged his hand, licking his fingers. Matthew then crouched down one last time. He scratched the thick fur behind the German shepherd's ears. "Watch over her, soldier," he whispered. Atlas gave a short, soft bark, a solemn promise between warriors. Matthew stood and his eyes found Alice's. For the first time since arriving in Charleston, the gray storm in his own eyes had finally cleared. "You didn't need me to save you, Alice. You just needed someone to stand with you while you saved yourself." He turned and walked to his truck, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. It was a sound of departure that felt both final and hopeful. He threw his bag onto the passenger seat and climbed in. As he turned the key, the engine roared to life. The engine's roar tore through the marsh's silence one last time. He wouldn't look back, not yet, as he put the truck in gear, and began the slow drive down the winding lane past ancient oaks that had witnessed both the violence and the victory, only reaching for a look at the bend in the road. Did his eyes lift to the rearview mirror? Framed in the glass was a vision bathed in the warm, golden light of the southern sun. There stood Alice and Atlas, not looking down, not looking back, but looking right at him, standing side by side, a fortress of two, the picture of unbreakable resilience. Alice raised her hand in a gentle wave as Atlas sat tall beside her, his ears pricked forward. A small, genuine smile touched Matthew's lips, a rare sight for a man who'd seen too much darkness. He realized then, for the first time in so many years, he wasn't driving away to escape a painful memory. He was driving forward filled with a new hope. He wasn't abandoning them. He was securing their world one final time. And as the truck vanished around the curve, returning the estate to its hard-won peace, Matthew knew one thing with absolute certainty. The world's wars might call his name, but this place, this peace, this newfound family, he would always come back to them. The soldier had finally found his way home. If this story of loyalty touched your heart and reminded you of the power of courage and faith, please share it with someone you love who needs to hear this message today. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the notification bell so you never miss a story that will lift your soul. Let us pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for being our shield and our mighty fortress. Just as you watched over Alice and sent help in her darkest hour, we ask that you watch over everyone listening to this message. Please protect their homes from the brutal storms of life. Guard their families from any harm and surround them with your angels. Give them the unshakable courage to stand firm in their faith and the heart to defend the innocent. Heal their wounds, comfort their lonely souls, and remind them that they are forever your beloved children. May your peace, which surpasses all human understanding, fill their spirits today and always. If you receive this blessing and truly believe in His protection, please write Amen in the comments below. May God bless you, and until next time.